Okay. Can you hear me and see me?
Yes, of course.
Good, good. Very good to be here with y'all. I realize it's quite early for most of you, so good job to get up early on a Saturday morning. And I'm looking forward to share some of my insights with you all. I'm calling from Sweden at the moment, so I'm in a cabin in the woods here in Sweden. Yeah, fun to be here. I'll share my screen and then let's get started. Yo hablo un poco español, pero no es bueno.
It's okay.
Solo un poco, sí. But maybe next time I can speak more Spanish as well. Let's see. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Good.
Yes, we can.
Perfect.
Yes.
So this is going to be a pretty kind of a wide and a little bit shallow overview of behavioral design from my perspective. And so, again, I don't really need to say too much more about me. I think that was a pretty good introduction. But I've been working with behavioral design for a long time. I was part of setting up the first behavioral design agency or behavioral insights team in Sweden. And yeah, it's been a big part of my life for a long time now. Wrote this book. It's currently only in Swedish, but hopefully it'll be in English soon as well. But the book was really about helping organizations to start using these insights in practice. So obviously we know a lot of research has been done, but there's still a lot of lack in ability and tools for people that work in organizations to start using these things. So that was the kind of aim of the book. And my kind of intentions for today is to, first of all, kind of help you think more like a behavioral designer. I'm sure some of you maybe already do. Part of this is also to, let's see, I'm going to minimize my screen here. So also to help you understand kind of process. So I'm very big on understanding the process rather than just thinking about learning a lot of words or stuff like that. And I'll get into that soon as well. And then what I think a lot of this has to do with is just seeing new lenses of the world. So when you learn more about behavioral design, you kind of start to see the world in a more nuanced way, and you might see things very differently. So hopefully I'll provide some of that as well. And then hopefully we can have some fun. It's Saturday, and I like to not take myself too seriously. And so I'm going to try to, even though we're going to talk about serious things, I'm going to try to make this light and fun as well. So let's get started. I'll also, so you know, I'm going to stay afterwards for some questions. So I'm sure you might have some questions because I'm going to go through quite a lot of things here. And I won't go into things very deeply. I will use more like cover how I think about behavioral design. And then afterwards you can kind of ask me some questions and hopefully I can have time to answer all of them. Yeah. So first question, what is behavioral design? That's a very, very common thing that asked to me. And so you can look at this in two ways. So one way to describe what something is by what it contains. So like if you try to describe a cake, you might say, well, a cake is made of sugar and all of this kind of thing. So you can say behavioral design is made of behavioral science, behavioral economics, UX service design, maybe some gamification. So that's one way to describe it. One other way is talking about what it does. And so we can say like a cake makes me happy, it makes me full, and so on. And behavioral design, what it tries to do is have a systematical way of designing for behavior change. So behavior change is the outcome that behavioral design is trying to achieve. And so that's usually how I try to define behavioral design. And that I think is more interesting because I care less about where the theory comes from, where the research comes from. Is it behavioral science, behavioral economics, traditional behavioral psychology, and so on? But more, does it work in changing behavior? Does it help me in changing behavior? And so I'm going to talk about user here, and the user is the kind of person we're trying to change in this scenario. And I'm going to make a metaphor here. I'm not sure how many of you have seen the movie Lord of the Rings, but I think it's a pretty good metaphor for kind of how I see the kind of the behavioral design journey or the user journey. And so all users have a problem. Like everyone has a problem they're trying to solve. And if you're doing a good job, you're trying to help the user solve that problem in a better way. And so in the Lord of the Rings, you have Frodo, and he's kind of going to be the pretend user in this scenario. And so Frodo has this problem because he has this ring, and he has to take this ring all the way to this place in Mordor, which is like a really bad place, and he has to drop this ring into this mountain of doom. Not an easy thing to do. And sometimes user journeys can be challenging for users. And so what usually you try to do here is you try to collect a team of people that are trying to kind of help the user in different ways. And so when I work with teams or organizations, usually have a mix of, it might be more technical skilled people, like people that are programmers and so on. It might be more visually design skilled people. It might be more research savvy people. And so like with Frodo needing some help, I think it's really good to have a kind of different types of perspectives when you're helping users. And then you have these couple of things that you need with you. And so not only is it good to have a map and a process to how you do your work, but also very obviously used to have skills and insights, like what are the tools and skills that we can kind of take to our advantage. And so I won't get it too deep in this metaphor right now because I could talk about it longer, but I think you kind of get the point, hopefully. And so the idea is that it's a journey. And to get this user from solving the problem to the desired outcome requires a couple of things. And so one of the most common things I hear about in terms of behavioral design is people talk about it as kind of a bag of tricks. And so what I usually talk about then as a metaphor is kind of, let's say you wanted to build this house. So you want to build this is a very Swedish looking house. You want to build a Swedish looking house, but you haven't built a house before. So you go to your builder, local builder, and you say, can you show me your toolbox and tell me the names of the tools that you have in your toolbox? And so it shows your toolbox and it says, well, this is a hammer, this is a screwdriver, this is a whatever. And then it's perfect. Now I know the names of these tools. Now I can go build a house. Well, obviously that's not how it works. That's not how you build a house. You need more than just the name of something. You need more is to like knowing the names of biases or names of different techniques. You need to know the process. And so that's why I think process is very important. And so this is a quote from Richard Feynman in the talks piece, but it's more important to know what something means than just knowing the name of something. And I think that is something that's very underrated. And that behavioral design is much more than just this kind of like cute and fancy techniques to change behavior. It's also a lot of it's the process to how to do that in a good way. And so, sure, you might use these tools and insights, but you also need the process and you need to kind of build up your skill set. It's the same way as the builder has both his tools and also kind of a map of how to make the kind of the architecture of the building. And also he has years and years of experience and skills to how to put this together and use the tools in a good way. So I usually say like we're all behavioral designers. Maybe the similar, like we all cook food. So we're all behavioral designers because we're human beings. We change the people around us. We change our own behavior. But like with cooking food, like some people are better than others. So you can obviously be a master chef as well. And so it's a big difference between a master chef and you're someone who cooks for themselves at home. And so that's why I see behavioral design. Really good behavioral designers are someone who's really kind of perfected this craft in the same way as maybe a master chef has done. So this is what I see as kind of the general behavioral design process. I realize there's two there should be only one. But this is not something that I've copyrighted. This is not something like extensive way of kind of, it has to be these names. But I've noticed that if you look at pretty much any organization around the world who use behavioral design, they use kind of following this kind of steps. They might call it different names. They might have 4 steps or 5 steps, but pretty much it all follows these 5 steps. And so I thought I'll kind of go through these 5 steps and kind of tell you what I think is important, or most important, at least, in these steps. So, first step, define key behavior. And so what I'm going to kind of use here as an explanation for what this step means is that what you're trying to do at first is kind of understanding what behavior needs to change. And I'm going to use this case study of Apple versus Google. And it's not the apple you think about. And so now I'm going to talk about the fruit. So in the US, they had this big call it like a crisis, where they noticed in the 80s that people weren't eating as much fruit and vegetables as they were supposed to do. And so they realized we need to do something big here to change how people think about this. And they realized that people didn't really know that they weren't supposed to eat 5 fruits a day, for example. And so they had this really, really ambitious campaign called five a day, where they tried to inform everyone that you have to eat 5 fruits a day. And so when they started this campaign in 1991, only 8% of people knew that you had to eat 5 fruits a day. Then in 1997, they raised that to almost 40%. So almost 40% of people in the US now knew that they were supposed to eat 5 fruits a day. And so that's an increase by almost 400%, like a huge increase in awareness. But what's interesting here, though, is did people eat more fruit? No, there was no change in behavior. They didn't change the behavior in this regard. And so look in another way at Google. So they have an interesting process of designing their workplaces. And one of the things they focus more and more on is thinking about how can we support our workers to eat more healthily. So in the same way, they had the same goal as the kind of US government had. They had to help people eat more fruits and vegetables. But instead of telling people what to do and increasing their awareness that they should eat fruits and should eat vegetables, they just made small changes in the environment, small changes that made it a little bit easier to eat healthy. They removed some of the sweets from next to the coffee. They made it so that in the fridges you could see the water in the fridges, but the soda was hidden. So you had to kind of open the kind of a special compartment to find the soda. So there's stuff like that. And these kind of subtle changes in the environment based on key behaviors had a really big effect. So they could see that there was 25% less snacking, much more breakfast salads, and so healthy meals that were made, and people drank 5 times more water versus soda than before. So here is the big difference, is that they focused on behaviors. They didn't think about changing people's attitudes, but on the behavior. And that's what we have to do. And so this is what it should say, that if you want to change the world, you have to change behaviors. And I think it's very true. And so far, I haven't have a good reason for why that's not true. Because behind every big challenge is a lot of behaviors we need to change. So what is the key behavior? Well, what I ask myself is like, what is the specific and measurable action that I want the user to take? And usually in this phase, what you're trying to understand is like, well, you might have an objective, an overall objective for the project. You might have something that you want to increase, maybe engagement, or you want to increase something. And so based on that overall objective, you want to ask, what is the key behavior that can kind of achieve this objective? What's very important here is that we're not talking about the outcome. This is just kind of one of the main actions that could contribute to a good outcome. We're not talking about attitudes, feelings, and beliefs. And when I say solution, I say that right now we're focusing on the behavior that needs to change. We're not thinking about how we're going to solve that behavior right now. So it's just understanding, okay, which behavior do we need to tackle is the first step. And so these are the fundamental questions that I would ask here. So what is the objective? So first determine kind of what is the metrics of success that I want to achieve in this project? And then based on those metrics, try to understand, okay, what is the behavior that needs to change? And here you can do a lot of things. You can just like try to find every possible behaviors that could achieve your outcome. And then I won't have time to talk about that now, but you can then in various ways kind of sort through them and qualify which ones will be more likely to be effective and more worthy to explore. So that's kind of the first step, defining a key behavior. Then we come to this step, which is called sometimes behavioral diagnosis. I usually call it behavioral audit, but you can call it many things. Pretty much is that this stage is about the problem. So it's so tempting to want to kind of jump to creating a solution, but we must understand the problem before we create the solution. And that is the most common mistake people make when they do a workshop or when I teach, in that as soon as they've discovered, okay, I have to change this behavior. I want to, let's say, get people to walk more often at work or to work, for example. then they start thinking right away, well, like, how could you do that? What could be the solution? Well, hold your horses, slow down. First, we have to understand what is the behavior, what is the problem, and we have to understand why are people not doing the behavior right now. And a good example of this is this case study from the UK. And so here, they knew that in the UK, like in Sweden, it can be pretty cold. And so they know if they can isolate the attics, so the top of the house, they can reduce energy expenses by a lot. And it's pretty good. It's good for the people, but also good for the kind of the country, because they have to produce less energy. And so they were willing to pay people to isolate their attics. And so they thought that, well, if we can just get people to isolate their attics, that'll be great. And so let's just give the savings to the people straight away. So they said, if you isolate your attic, we do it for you, and you get £100 or something. You get some money. And so did this money thing work? Paying people to isolate attics, it failed. So it's strange, because like, why would you not want to isolate your attic, and why would you not want to get money? It's two good questions. Well, here they didn't do any behavioral diagnosis or behavioral audit until they realized that this failed. And then they started to interview people and talk to people, and they realized that this is not how an attic looked like. This is how an attic looked like. It's not empty, it's packed. And people don't want to think about what's in their attic. They feel like what's there is going to stay there, and they don't want to even like think about cleaning that up. And so this really big barrier, having to clean your attic, stopped a lot of people. And so when they then changed it so that they included a cleaning of the attic with this, and they removed some of the financial incentives, so they became a little bit money, but you also get a cleaning. That was very effective. And so it's understanding the problem before you kind of create a solution is a very good example here. And so that's what we're trying to do in this kind of stage. And so you can look at this in like three basic components. And so this can be done in different ways, but generally you do something like some form of research review, where you look at, okay, who has tried to solve this problem before? What have they found? What is the information we can find on research on this problem? Then you look at your specific problem. You talk to your users and you do some user research. And then hopefully through these two stages, you will have some behavioral insights. And so the behavioral insights is kind of what you're really striving to get here. So I'll tell a little bit more how this can look like. But the two like key things here that we really want to understand is, first, we have to understand the person, and we have to understand the situation. And so no people are alike, and the same thing, no situations are the same as well. And how they interact is where kind of the really interesting thing happens. So if you have a coffee shop, it's really interesting to think about who are your users. How do their life look like outside the coffee shop? What do they like to do? What do they kind of what are their passions? What are their kind of drives? But also you always want to understand like how the situation influence them in their behaviors. And so you will study like both maybe how they interact and what they do outside of the coffee shop, but also obviously how they interact inside the coffee shop and how the coffee shop influences their behaviors. And so those two components are kind of what you're trying to peek into a little bit in the stage. And here there's a lot of different ways we can look at this. And unfortunately, I can't look into or explain all of these things, but this is usually how I kind of paint this picture of the different user research methods. So either you can focus on kind of what people do, so behavioral, or you can focus on what people say, and so that's more attitudinal. You can also focus more on things like qualitative data, which is more about why people do something, or you can focus more on like the quantitative stuff, like what people do. And so if I just plot these different methods here, you can see that there's some methods in each box. And so what I usually do is like I try to get something from each box, for example, or at least from 2 or 3 boxes. And so it's really interesting to compare what people do and what they say, for example. And it's also really interesting to compare kind of first generating insights of what people do and then trying to peek down deeper in understanding why they do the thing. So again, I can't talk about all these things because usually I would spend a full day just teaching on, for example, this part, or even more than that. But I'll talk a little bit about behavioral mapping, because I think that's something that most people haven't heard about that much. So I'll talk a little bit about behavioral mapping. So here you're pretty much trying to understand what are the steps for the user in their kind of user journey. And here you're thinking pretty much every step they take, not only like the key behavior, but all of the steps kind of before and after as well. And especially kind of the steps leading up to the key behavior will be really interesting. And so there's no real like template for how this must look like. So this is one example, for example, here. So here they're trying to understand if a student wants to apply for this form that's going to give them some money back, what are the steps for kind of submitting this form? And so from the decide to apply to the submitting the form, they kind of map out all the steps. And then to some of the steps, they added some data insights and some other stuff. So that's one way of looking at it. Another way I can show you through this case study with a company called Miley, or it's actually a project that I was part of building and creating. And so I was chief kind of behavioral insights lead on this big EU project where we're going to see if we can help people quit smoking and drinking, which is pretty hard things to change. So for this project, it was particularly relating to surgery. So we knew that people going to surgery, if they can stop smoking and drinking before surgery, they can quadruple their chances of a successful recovery. So 4 times better recovery if they can just stop smoking and drinking for 12 weeks. And so we have to design an app to kind of help them through those 12 weeks and help them kind of quit smoking and drinking. So again, this is a very complex problem. It's very hard to understand what is it that makes people smoke and drink. And so here we used a version of behavioral mapping where you could, in behavioral mapping, you could do a lot of different things. You can look at what they do, their behaviors, touch points. You can look at some cognitive biases. You can look at their moods. You can look at a lot of different things, but it's hard in a behavioral mapping process to do all of those things. So you're trying to like focus on certain things that you want to really narrow in on. And so in this scenario, we looked at especially kind of these 3 steps. And so this is what I call the ABC model. It's an actual model. It's more than me calling that, but it's I modified a little bit. So traditionally, it's called antecedent, behavior, and consequence. And it's an old model from cognitive and clinical psychology. And so what pretty much it's trying to do is like it knows that, well, before behavior happens, it needs to be something that activates behavior. It needs to be something that comes before. And then after the behavior happens, there's always going to be some consequence. Doing the behavior is going to lead to something. And so when you map these 3 things, you're trying to map what activates the behavior, when, where, and how often is the behavior happening, and then what happens after doing this behavior. And so we did this in a very, very simple way. So this is just a very simple way of looking at it. So we had this start up here to end up here. So this is the one day. And then we had user interviews where we invited users who were either smokers or drinkers. And then we simply asked them, when and how often do you, let's say, smoke or drink? And then they started to kind of list during the day. Well, I have a smoke when I wake up. I have a smoke when I wait for the bus. I have a smoke when I take a coffee break at work, and so on. And once we kind of identified all those things, we had to ask them little questions about what is happening around you when you're smoking. And so we started adding these touch points to this process. So the first cigarette maybe was when I was at home, eating breakfast with a spouse. Second was at a cafe, with a client meeting, and interacting with a cashier or people at the coffee shop. And the last one was at a break room at work with colleagues. So then we have kind of the scene. And then we're trying to kind of ask the users in a kind of not so academic way, but in a very kind of simple way of like, okay, so what makes you feel like having a cigarette then? Like, or drink then? Like, what happens before? And what activates the behavior? And so we started to understand, like, well, let's say here was they feel tired and they had cravings in the morning. But then at the coffee shop, they actually smoked because the client was smoking and felt stressed. And then at the afternoon cigarette, they smoke at a certain time. They used to smoke at 3 p.m. they felt tired and stressed, and the colleagues smoked. So that was kind of what triggered the behavior we could see. But also we're curious, like, okay, what happens afterwards? And so they say, well, after I smoke, I felt energized and great feeling in the morning. But that cigarette they had at the coffee shop, they didn't really notice. More than bad breath. That was pretty much the only thing they noticed they had afterwards. But then the one afternoon, they felt a little bit less tired, they felt ready to finish the day strong. And so this is just one example of how one user interview could look like. But we did a lot of these. And so after all of these, we had a lot of data points to kind of when do people smoke and drink, but also what happens before and after. And so we could kind of understand better what kind of contributes to this behavior happening and how we can maybe help stopping that behavior. And so if we wanted to remove just one cigarette here, it's quite obvious that this one might be easier to remove, for example. And so that's one way of looking at behavioral mapping. This is a simple version, and you can do it in many different ways. But maybe this can inspire you a little bit. So the fundamental questions we're asking in this stage is, what makes this behavior happen? So how can we better understand the kind of the user in the context? And then we're trying to kind of define the problem. So can we somehow, through, let's say, behavioral mapping or otherwise, like list the barriers, the drives, the biases, here in this regard, the activators or the consequences and so on. And so we kind of understanding the problem much better when we're starting to kind of list out these things. And already coming at this stage, we've come a really long way. If we have a really good understanding of a problem, we almost can see how the solution could come about just from here. So having a really good kind of behavioral audit makes the rest of the journey much, much easier as well. But here we come to stage 3, which is designing the behavior change solution. Or intervention, you call it as well. And so this is obviously, for many people, kind of the most exciting or more sexy part of this journey, because now you bring out your toolkit and you're like, okay, what behavior change techniques could we use to change this behavior? The only problem here as well is that there are so many behavior change techniques. So this was a deck that had helped create for a school in Thailand. And so I'll be working in Asia a little bit this year. And they kind of wanted to map out different techniques. And so there's so many techniques that you could use. And so it's easier said than done to say, we're just going to like throw out certain techniques on this behavior. And so you can look at this 2 different ways. You can either focus on the techniques and think about, could we make it easier? Could we make it more timely? And so on and so forth. But also you could think about the motivations. And so I call these kind of motivation boosters. And this is like 6 of those kind of different things that motivates people to do something. And again, this is just part of this. Sometimes you don't need to motivate people. Sometimes you just need to make it easier, for example. But this is kind of to showcase how this can be done in practice. And so we have 6 here. We have urgency is a very motivational thing. Kind of this traditional reward, carrot, can be very motivating. This idea of doing commitment, so saying that you will do something and staying consistent to that can be motivating. But you also have these 3 things at the bottom here. And so I would say these are kind of what I call like the top motivational boosters, because all of these things at the bottom, achievement and progress, belonging and status, and self-direction and meaning, is trying to understand what is kind of the underlying motives, the intrinsic rewards for people. And so when you achieve those types of achievements or those kinds of motivations, you will have a much longer lasting successful behavior change usually than if you're just trying to get people to do something by urgency or by reward. But I'll show how this kind of looks like in a case study. And so I don't know if you know Duolingo. Funny enough, this is how I've been studying Spanish. So partly through Duolingo is kind of one of the main methods for learning Spanish. And so I thought it would be fun to kind of use Duolingo as a case study here. And so they obviously use urgency quite often, I've noticed. And so they have sometimes notifications saying, hey, time is running out. If you don't do your lessons now, you're going to lose place in the leaderboard. Or they might give you a certain boost but the boost is only available for the next 30 minutes or 30 seconds, for example. And so that's one way they kind of trying to motivate users. Another way is more like these traditional think rewards, in a sense of like giving people badges or giving people some form of virtual coins is something they give. So every lesson you do, you get some form of gems as well. And then they have this use of commitment consistency, where they're trying to, in a very smart way, actually, in the beginning when you sign up, you can decide how much you want to kind of use Duolingo per day. And so you make commitment that I want to kind of learn 5 minutes a day or 10 minutes a day and so on. But they also have these different challenges like double or nothing, where you bet some of your coins or your gems. And if you're able to do every lesson for 7 days in a row, you double your coins. So that's a way they kind of do that stuff. But I would say all of those three things are not making the experience of learning a language better. It's kind of bells and whistles that makes maybe a little more motivating to stick to your learning, but it doesn't make the learning itself better. So they're trying to kind of find ways like how can we make people feel competent in what they do. And so they have certain tiers you can unlock. You can have streak functions, or you can achieve something like that, or you can advance in kind of a leaderboard to achieve certain things that way as well. Still, it's very focused on kind of external things like streaks and positions in the leaderboard. But they're trying to kind of get this whole idea of like how can we make people feel a little more at least status seeking or status achieving. And here's an example of me. You can see me, I have a pretty good streak there. I had 116 days, but it was still less than my friend Jonathan. And so I was quite motivated actually to learn, because I wanted to kind of catch up with him. And it was somewhat futile because I actually never managed to catch up with Jonathan. But that's that's a different story. But so that's another way they can kind of trying to get people to be motivated by having some more social part here. And then the last one, which I sometimes think is most important, is this kind of idea of self-direction meaning. And here is probably where they maybe don't do as much as they could. So why does someone download a language app? Well, it's probably not to collect badges. It's probably not to collect coins. It's probably not to compete with friends. It's probably not to build a streak. It's to become better in that language. It's to use the language to do things. So I learned Spanish, so I'm going to be able to, at some point, maybe next time we speak, I can maybe do this presentation in Spanish. So I can better communicate with people around the world, right? But Duolingo focuses very little on that part of the experience. They make the learning pretty fun with the lessons, but they never really reinforce that idea of that I'm mastering this language and I'm becoming more able to go to a coffee shop and order something, for example, at a coffee shop. I never really understand how good I'm getting beyond this little like mini sphere which is in the app. And so that's something that I generally think people could think more about. How can we make people feel like they're kind of having more autonomy and can really have a clear sense of meaning in what to do. Anyway, so that's one way of looking at this. But again, the behavior change techniques you can find online. There's a lot of different resources for different ways of changing behavior. But the most important thing is kind of understanding when and how to best use them as well. Because one of the things you don't want to do is use what's called dark patterns. And so I find it's a hard balance sometimes, but I think Duolingo perhaps do a little bit more than it should. And so this is usually things that are kind of called like a negative or kind of a little more punishing motivation. And so here you might get a message, for example, saying that you made Duolingo sad. So I don't know how you make a virtual owl sad, but apparently I made this little thing sad. And then they have also, so actually get up to about 312 day streak, right? But when I inevitably lost that streak, because I didn't really care anymore. At some point, I didn't feel like the streak was that important. But they knew that this is a very emotional moment, probably for most people, when they lose a streak. And so they had that as a thing, like, well, okay, we're really sorry that you lost your streak. That's terrible. You've lost something. But if you pay us, we can give it back to you. So you can repair the streak if you sign up for our Plus version. So yeah, I would say that's a very fine line of being probably a little bit overly manipulative here. And if you look at Duolingo forums, these kind of things pop up. So someone on Twitter saying, Jesus Christ, Duolingo, that's one hardcore email campaign. You can see how many likes and retweets this kind of tweet has. It's pretty intense. And then a user has gone out of their way to kind of Photoshop this animation saying, 5 in a row, well done. 5 more days and we'll let your brothers out of the gulag. And gulag is a concentration camp, another word for concentration camp. And so if your user is making these kind of jokes, it probably means that you're maybe using too intense tactics. And you should probably think about what you're doing. So yeah. So that's the kind of thoughts on Duolingo and how they use different behavior change techniques. But again, we can use these kind of motivation boosters, and then we can think about them either in this way, or you can just think about them from just the kind of behavior change technique perspective. And I'll show an example of that soon as well. But what we're trying to answer here is kind of, okay, what could be a solution for this problem? And here, it's really thankful to use generate ideas. I think we spend a little bit too much time being critical of what could be a good solution. You just should spend more time just being open and generating good ideas. Because a lot of these problems might require some unconventional solutions. And then what we're trying to do, we try to leave this stage with a clear hypothesis. So let's say we wanted to make people walk more often. Then we should have a hypothesis that if we do this thing, if we use these behavior change techniques, we should be able to increase walking behavior by 20%, for example. So it's very important to leave this stage for something that you can actually test and like some form of hypothesis that you can use. Because that's what we're coming to now. We're coming to a stage of like wanting to test and run an experiment. And so here we're trying to kind of really lean into this idea of test, learn, and adapt. And by using kind of early testing and doing pilot testing and really small scale testing, we can over time create a much more effective and impactful solution. So the most basic version of an A/B test looks something like this. You have a website, let's say, and you have a banner on the website. You want people to sign up to your online course. You can either use, let's say, one message to say, hey, only 10 spots available, sign up today. So using more scarcity. Or maybe you can say, 500 people have already signed up, you should sign up too. Well, that's using a little more social norms. And you're not sure maybe which message is going to work the best. And so you kind of randomly assign that every visitor gets a random message. And then over, let's say, 2,000 visits to your website, you see that, okay, which one has the most clicks? So that's a very, very basic version of an A/B test. And sometimes tests can be very simple. You don't have to make them too complicated. And so I will show you the most basic and simplest of tests that I've done, but it was still a very fun and interesting experiment. And so this is through Behavior Lab, which I used to work with here in Sweden. And so Behavior Lab is the first kind of Swedish behavioral insights team. And so here we were invited to kind of help a conference to see if they can do some fun behavioral experiment with their participants. This is more for fun than anything more serious, but still should be some form of experiment here. And so this conference, we had 800 participants. And what was interesting here is that these participants went for their coffee breaks. In Swedish, that's called fika. So they went for their fika, their coffee breaks, in 2 different rooms. And so 400 people went to one coffee room, and 400 went to another coffee room. And so because of this, we're very curious, well, maybe we could do an experiment for their coffee break. And we realized that for the coffee break, they served these brownies. And we thought, well, maybe this could be a fun way of doing an experiment. So as probably many of you have heard about, there's this idea of a default option. So if we make the desired behavior, the default behavior, it's more likely to kind of happen. But here we care less about kind of understanding what was kind of desired behavior and more just seeing, okay, which default option would be leading to more consuming of brownies. And so one thing we did was at one floor, we had full-size brownies, and then at another floor, we had half-size brownies. So change the defaults, but in a very, very basic and simple way. So now my question to you, maybe you can, if you want, you can write your best guess in the comment section. Which floor do you think ate more brownies? I'll give you 20 seconds to think about which floor do you think ate more brownies, whether they were full-sized or half-sized. Okay, let's see. So what's interesting here is like they ate a lot of brownies, right? They ate a lot of brownies. Almost 70 kilos of brownies was consumed during this break. But what we could see is that they ate 47 kilos of brownies in the full-size one and 21 kilos of brownies in the other one. And we also measured the trash bins to see if they threw away more brownies in one than the other, but no difference there. And we also measured their happiness of the coffee break, and they rated the coffee break as equally good. So pretty much what happened here is that they just consume much more brownies on one floor than the other floor. So I can talk a little more about that maybe if you have any questions, but the general hypothesis here is that this was a very automatic action. You took your brownies while talking to someone else, so you didn't think about how much you took, and you just took like the standard portion. And then you consumed all of that because you didn't really think about feeling full. And then why it was more than twice as much in the full brownies, because probably still some people wanted to have an extra bite. And so that doubled, again, the likelihood of kind of the difference. So that's kind of part of the reasons. But it's just an interesting experiment here of how big of a difference it makes. And here we had a very basic version of testing this. And so we just measured, like, for example, how many participants went into each room. So make sure that there was equal amount of participation in each room. And then we counted how many brownies were left at the end. So what I encourage is to test as much as you can, even if it's not the most elaborate and advanced experiments, but try to do an experiment. And if you're curious about this more, one of the most important things you have to consider is the kind of your power calculation. How many data points do you need to know if your behavior change strategy has worked? And so you can Google power calculations if you want to know more about that. But yeah, we're pretty much approaching the end of the talk. So I won't talk too much more. I'm going to leave for some questions. But the last stage is obviously implement and scale. And so here I could talk more about this, but there's not too much to say in terms of from the experiment phase, you will try to figure out what works. And once you realize it works, then you can scale that. You can scale that, and obviously you should still test and learn, because you never know. Sometimes when you scale, you might realize that things work differently in different settings. But still, you can kind of really take off your solution at that point. So that's kind of the idea here. Like, great, it works. Now what? So, well, scale. Scale it and then continue to test, learn, and adapt. It's kind of the last fundamental question here. Wow, that was intense. I realized I've spoken pretty quickly, but I really want to get through this. So hopefully you're awake by this point, and we've been able to get through this whole process. So virtual high five to all of us. Dance party, everyone? No dance party yet. I'm sure you're still probably in bed. So I won't force you to dance, but what I'll say is that if you want to learn more, check out my Habit Weekly newsletter. That's a great place to learn more about this. So in the newsletter, I combine the best things that I find every week from the world of behavioral science and behavioral design. And I try to only kind of pick out the best things and share the best insights every week. So if you want to make sure you don't miss out on the best insights, then you should sign up to the newsletter. Also, I created this guide on 100 best books. And so when you sign up to the newsletter, you get a copy of this guide as well sent to you. Or I think in the second email, you get an email about 1 hour after you sign up, where you get all of the resources that you can use. And so here I kind of have compiled 100 best books that I think exist in behavioral design. And I've kind of designed them so that you can see which book to read depending on what you want to do in your work. But that's all I have to say. So thank you so much. I hope that was helpful, and maybe I can answer some of your questions. Wow, I see a lot of comments here. It's good to see that it seems pretty positive comments. That's happy to see that. For questions, either if you want to unmute yourself or if you want to write the questions in the comment section, I'll kind of look at the questions now. So I see one question here from Carlos. What are your top 5 behavioral designers in the world? That is a great question. That's pretty much talking about my friends. I don't know if I can actually, no, I can't answer that question. It's like, that is talking about a lot of my friends. So I feel like if I would say that, I'll probably leave out someone, and I don't want to do that. Same thing as you would have to list your favorite kids. It's a risky business. So I will skip that question. Favorite book. So I feel like there's so many great books, and that's kind of why I have a list of 100 best books. So I would say, like, if you're a little bit new, a great book that I really enjoy is Influence by Robert Cialdini. It's been around for a long time, but it's still very, very good book, easy to read. If you're a little more advanced and really want to understand kind of what makes behavior happen and nerd out about behavior, then you can check out, I'll actually write these 2 books here in the comments so you can see Influence. And then Behave Sapolsky. So Behave by Sapolsky is a nerdy book, but it's an amazing, amazing book. If you read that book and really study that book, you probably know more than most people in this field, to be honest. Okay, I have a question about Sweden. Good question here. So the question is, there's no lockdown in Sweden right now. Is there any insights behind the decision of this government lockdown or decision not to have lockdown? Or is it just that immunical reasons, maybe related to social habits? Yeah, so I would say it's very tricky to know and say too much about anything COVID-19 right now. So obviously Sweden has taken a little different approach. What I would say is that if this proves to be successful for Sweden, it's probably something that doesn't mean that it works for everyone else. So what's special with Sweden is that we're a very big country in size, but a very small population. So we're bigger than the UK, but only 9 million people. I think we're twice the size of the UK, but only 9 million people. And so it's very not so dense population. And also people are very trusting in the government. And so the government has not made any rules, but have been very clear of saying things like social distance, stay inside if you have to, or if you don't have to, go outside. And people have kind of responded pretty well to those things. So I think that's partly why it seems to be relatively working right now in Sweden, but still also quite early to tell. And also our capacity for hospital has been pretty well. So in Sweden, we were able to triple our ICU, so our hospital capacity in a couple of weeks. And so that made it easier for us to have a less aggressive strategy. But I think definitely it has to do a little bit also. It's funny, but Swedish people are not very social as it is. Like, if you come to Sweden in the summer, you will probably see people outside, but it's not like in Spain or in many other countries around the world. And I'm sure in Peru, I haven't been in Peru yet. I would love to come some point, but I'm sure you might have more people outside more of the time. But in Sweden, people are more kind of to themselves. So I think maybe that has some component as well. But again, it's really hard to say that now. Probably in a year from now, we will know more about the COVID-19. So a good question here is like, is it always about behavior? So yes and no. So I would say it's still important sometimes to consider attitudes, obviously. So if you wanted to get people to eat healthier, then obviously if they don't know that vegetables are healthy, it's going to be a big barrier. So it's good to be able to inform people that it's good to eat vegetables, for example. But at a certain point, you still have to change the behavior. And so I think kind of combining those things, understanding the attitudes, but also kind of focusing on behavior is going to be, in the end, kind of the most important thing. Another question here. I'm curious about synergy and applications of behavioral design into cultural transformation and learning. Any experience you can share on that? Yes, I can. So I think you talk about cultural transformation in terms of organizational change and so on, and learning. So I think what I use a lot is just understanding, or like using understanding of how humans work in how I design when I do some form of cultural transformation work or learning work. In that traditionally when we do workshops and that kind of stuff, we think that we can speak for a whole day and then we can give information to people and then we expect people to do different things after that. But we know from behavioral science that people don't really work that way. And so I think you have to be much more focused on not so much what you want people to do, or like in terms of or learning and teaching people the kind of insights, but more how can I help people apply these insights? So how can I make this as easy and clear for people as possible how they can implement the things you're trying to teach them? That's going to be always the most important thing. And then it's a little obvious, but I think sometimes underestimate how much of an influence people at the top have in cultural transformation. If you don't have a good buy-in from the organization with the top leadership being willing to make changes, it's going to be very hard because they're going to be the most important people to kind of change. And you're going to be very hard to change the kind of the lower tier staff if you can change the people at the top as well. These are quick questions. I could talk and answer this question for a longer time, but I'm trying to answer all of them. So I'm going to giving short answers. So best book to start, again, I think Influence is a great book. I think Predictably Rational is another great book to start with. And you can see in my guide, I have some more books to start with as well. Okay, here's a good question, a little bit longer. It says, I would like to implement behavioral design in the company I work. Since there's a lot of emotional shock due to COVID-19, but the company has branches in different provinces. In what steps should we adapt the experiment to this population? Yeah, really good question. And I actually would probably say that I can't answer that in a short way. That I will have to get more time to give you support with and understanding better kind of your unique circumstances with the company you work for and the situation. So I don't want to give you any false quick tips. That's not going to work. But if you want, send me an email and maybe I can expand more in an email or something. Okay, so are you interested in semiotics? I guess the academic field could be very useful in behavioral science because it studies how people create meaning and understand science. Yeah, sure, that can be very interesting for sure. And I think if you look at the book Behave by Robert Sapolsky, you see that what he looks at like 7 different ways of looking at behavior. And he shows that behavior can be explained in so many different ways. I like to have more than less different perspectives when I look at understanding behavior. So different perspectives can be really, really useful. Which countries do you think are the most advanced in this field? So it's pretty obvious that I think the US and the UK are the 2 countries where they have done the most work for a long time. That's where I would do probably half of my work is in the US or the UK. Actually, right now I'm doing a big project in the UK. So I think that's probably where the biggest and most kind of advanced usage are currently happening. But then I would say it's pretty random. I obviously helped kind of build the field here in Sweden for the last five years or so. But Sweden is still very, very early stage. And actually looking at my newsletter, I can see certain countries that are bigger than other countries. And that doesn't mean that they're more advanced, but it might say that they are more popular in those countries. And I think as well with Australia, probably Canada, pretty popular. I would say in Europe, Netherlands is pretty established as well. So here Carol says, sorry, she says you raised her hand, sorry I didn't see that. Do you think there's sorry, it's a longer question. Okay, so this is a really good question. So it's about how we can change behavior in different ways. And so when I teach about nudging, for example, it's easy to say nudging is this amazing, magical thing that solves all problems. But it's good also being honest about different ways to change behavior. And so traditionally, obviously, regulations and laws has been a very common way to change behavior. And I would say that's still very effective. And many times it's more effective to use a law or a regulation than to, for example, nudge. And I would say that what we should try to do is not see that one way is the only way, for like nudging, for example, but more how can we see different perspectives, and depending on the situation, maybe modify that. So sometimes nudging is going to be impactful, sometimes maybe a regulation will be more impactful, but what's interesting, we can always combine as well. So we can make usually a law more effective by nudging communication, for example, or nudging parts of that strategy as well. So I think a combination is probably a good way of looking at it. But I'm happy to hear that you're actually a lawyer and a behavioral designer. That's cool. How would you say isolation is impacting in behavior change techniques that are applied or to apply? It's much harder. It's much harder. So one of the things that's really important to think about is that when we change behavior, we can only operate in the context we have access to, with environments we have access to. So I've been part of projects here in Sweden, for example, where we were meant to change behaviors relating to recycling. But it's really hard to change recycling behaviors if we can't get into people's homes, because that's where they make the decisions in many ways. That's at least a start of how to recycle. And so when you're trying to change behavior now, it's much harder because everyone is just at home. So we can't really get into people's homes in the same way as you could change people's behaviors in the workplace or when they are in the public places. But then you can obviously modify behavior through technology in a more advanced way now. But still, it's harder to change behavior now than before. And you probably have to think more about measures that can be more adapted digitally right now. Okay, I'm probably answering most questions now. I'm pretty happy I'm able to get through most of them, I think. Ever faced a behavior challenge where the desired change for your client triggered ethical questions about negative impacts on trying to change the behavior? Yes, many times. I think that it's going to be part of being a behavioral designer is going to having to always consider these ethical perspectives. And what I try to think about is the user. And so when I say the user is the person which behavior I'm trying to change. And so what I'm trying to understand is like, do people want to change this behavior? And also, if I do this intervention, can I do some form of study to see or test to see if they were happy having changed this behavior or not? Because there's no simple answer here in terms of what are good things and bad things. If you look at a grocery store, a supermarket, and you see at the checkout line, you see candy. So some people might argue that having candy at the checkout line is really unethical because it's on the eye level of kids, and you're going to have a lot of parents that are tired, and the kids are going to be upset and they're going to scream and they want a candy, and then the parents are going to feel forced to buy candy for the kids. So it's a very manipulative and bad way to sell candy, for example. But then the candy manufacturers will say, well, hey, we're selling happiness. We're selling pleasure. Why would it be a bad thing to give people more happiness and pleasure through candy, for example? And so what I would do there is actually what you did in the UK, where they tried to see what happens if you remove this. Do people feel unhappy that they haven't consumed as much candy as they wanted? And obviously they felt very happy that they actually ended up having much less consumption. Actually, just reducing the candy at the checkout line reduced candy consumption by families by 20%. So that was a big part of contributing to candy consumption by families, was just having candy at checkout lines. And so that is a way to tackle that. I don't know if I'm completely answering your question, but I will always try to focus on not so much only the client, but actually the user in mind. So obviously, if my client is a cigarette company, they want me to change their customers to buy more cigarettes. Then for me, I will easily say no, because I don't want to sell more cigarettes, for example. So even the client wants me to get people to do this thing, I know that a lot of people don't want to smoke more, for example. So I'm not going to kind of focus on that kind of behavior. Yeah. Whoa, that was a lot of questions in a short time. I answered a lot of questions in a short time, I realized. I hope that gave you some insights. And again, feel free to reach out. I can show you my mail address once again. If you have any questions, you can always reach out on my mail. So it's Sam at samuelsalzer.com. And then for sure, I would love if you sign up to have a weekly. Let me know what you think. And then apart from that, I just wish you a good day. And hopefully I can see you all in person at some point. Okay. I'm going to check any more questions. No. Okay. Well, thanks everyone. Muchas gracias. Hasta luego.